Well, I would like to introduce myself first. I'm Werner Haag. I am presently working for Mobil Oil Company in the Corporate Research Department, the Central Research Division. And I suppose I've been asked to tell you a little bit about myself. So I would like to probably should start at the very beginning. I've often thought about it, how I got into science and into chemistry. And I can identify at least two different forces that were responsible at the time. I went to high school, what we call high school here in Germany. It was gymnasium in Germany in the 30s and 40s, early 40s. And it was a great time for science to develop at the time. I got a book that my father gave me called Aniline, which showed the great advances that have been made in the dye industry and the chemical industry that was building around coal tar. And it was really a fascinatingly written book. So that was one of the inputs I can remember very well. And the second aspect was we had in the gymnasium which I attended a chemistry teacher. He was a very tough and very demanding man. He was really a taskmaster on the one hand, but on the other hand he was extremely knowledgeable. He had a PhD in chemistry. He demanded a lot and taught us an awful lot in chemistry, so we all had the feeling we know everything there is to know about chemistry after we had taken his course for 4 years. It was obligatory at the time. And out of that class there were a relatively high percentage of students going into chemistry later on. But it wasn't so clear-cut at the time what I should do, because I also liked the classics and classical languages, and I toyed for the longest time with the idea of going to university and study classical languages. So it was a toss-up between either going into science or into some of this, more into the more fundamental and more elaborate language studies. Then the decision had to be postponed because the war broke out, and I just got in for the last year in the war. I was drafted in the army, and so future professions was far away at that time, and there were other priorities. I ended the war, that's a funny perhaps sideline, as a prisoner of the American 7th Army, and was in a big field together with 50,000 other soldiers in an open field, and we were spending day and night there without any tents and anything else, just on the ground for a couple of months. It was a very interesting experience. You had to reflect on life an awful lot and what it's all about, and all the conventional things had dropped away. You had to really go down to the basics, survival, eating, and worrying about pain or not, and that was the only thoughts one had at the time. Just perhaps a humorous side note that is appropriate here. We were fed enough to survive, so there was no complaints on that side, but we were always hungry, extremely so. And we were surrounded, our camp was surrounded by a chicken wire fence. And walking along the fence from the inside, I saw a dandelion growing on the outside. And I had my eyes on that dandelion and watched it every day until it grew up, because I know they make a very fine dandelion salad. It was something to eat. So I watched it, and one day, when I thought it was about time, excuse me, to get it before somebody else would get it, I walked up to the fence and lifted the fence a little bit and reached out to get my prize dessert here for them after lunch. And of course the guards that watched outside the fence, they didn't know what I had in mind, so they thought I was trying to escape, and the machine gun fire started shooting at me. Fortunately they were far away, and they, I'm not sure if they tried to discourage me or missed me on purpose or not, but I quickly grabbed my dandelion and put it back and ate it with relish afterwards. Well, this is just by illustrating of how very small things became very important at the time, and so. Shortly thereafter, I was released, and of course one couldn't go into university because they were all flooded with 4 or 5 years worth of soldiers that came back and had priorities, veterans. So I spent time doing all kinds of things. Went back to school for another year and finished my and graduated then, and also worked in construction and helped my uncle on the farm and so on during the summer. And finally I got into university, and I applied in 2 places, in Heidelberg, which was famous because of one Professor Freudenberg. He was an old master in carbohydrate chemistry, very famous. And then I went, and the other alternative was Tübingen, where Wittig was the head of the director of the Chemical Institute. And in the German tradition, of course, the institute is famous by that one director who is, really sets the tone and has a prestige. So I finally decided for Tübingen and started out there. And I went through the ranks and did my work with Wittig then, ultimately in organometallic chemistry. It was mostly synthesis work. And I had the good fortune to start a project that, together at about the same time some other graduate student did it, both of us, we started at about the same time, that was ultimately extremely successful. It was work on ylids and phosphorus ylids that led to the famous Wittig synthesis of using phosphorus ylids for making olefins from aldehydes and ketones. So we started out, and it was a great, wonderful thing to do because we had a new reaction every week and so on to work. It was very tough work because Wittig had the habits of visiting each student, each of his 30 students, twice a day, in the morning and the afternoon. And each time he asked you what's new. So that wasn't, you really felt the pressure there. And if he didn't come by, then you know you didn't do anything right. So he just penalized you by ignoring you. But it was a very exciting period. And of course, ultimately, subsequently after we left, and so much more work was done, and Wittig ultimately got the Nobel Prize for this work, outstanding in connection with other things he had done. There was at that same time, laboratory co-worker worked on benzyne synthesis, and Elisabeth de Pommer, and she just, when I finally left the laboratory, just the day before, she had the final proof that she had made benzyne. So there was great things happened of importance in organic chemistry and theoretically. And so, well, I shortly before, halfway through my graduate, this was undergraduate work and what is in Germany called a diplom. And I worked on my Diplomarbeit, which is somewhat equivalent, perhaps a little more so than what you have to do here for a master's in the United States. By that time I was married, and we had, I might mention that this came about while we worked very hard in Tübingen at the time. The generation of students there were very serious. They had most of them had been in the war. and they were very dedicated to finish their college work and go into profession and so on. So there was a great seriousness among the students. But nevertheless, we also had some fun. And on a skiing trip that was organized by the university to the Alps, I met this young girl, my future wife. She was an American who had come to Tübingen to do graduate work in geology. And she had got an undergraduate degree from Northwestern in geology and was now working towards an advanced degree. And she did field research and so on, and collected specimens and ammonites and identified them and so on. So anyway, we got to know each other, and eventually, after a few years, 2 years later or so, we got married and started a family. And when her visa expired, she couldn't prolong it. She had to go back to the United States, and I decided this is a good time for me to try to go with her at least for a few years to the United States, because I could get an easy visa under the circumstances, and see what it's like over there, and then of course come back. Well, we came to the United States in summer of 1955, and my father-in-law had an apartment waiting for us at the north side of Chicago, and it was very helpful getting us started, and he showed me a little bit around, and I wanted, however, immediately to get a job, because I felt responsible for the family, which by that time we had just about 3 children. And while he said, oh, just take your time to look and enjoy it for a little bit and get your feet wet here, I said, no, I need to do my job in looking out for the family. So within a week, I had a job working for Swift & Company in the Chicago stockyards. They had not only all their operations there, but they also had a research laboratory, which was very, very modest. There were about 7 people in the industrial oils division. And what they tried to do is make higher value added products out of their plentiful raw materials they had, like fatty acids and oil, which to them were lard, and which were low value products. The Chicago stockyard in those days were still highly operated. They brought in thousands, I believe about 5,000 cattle a day, heads of cattle, which they brought in by train and truck. And they were, every day when I used the elevator to go to work, it was just positioned above the stockyards, and it was running middle through the stockyard, and you look down left and right, and all the corrals where the beef cattle were, and where the buyers were looking around and bought them in lots and different things. They were slaughtered then in the Chicago stockyards. Swift and Armour and Cattle and so on. Some other companies were there, and they were butchered and processed. So the industrial oils division was of Swift. This was in one of these buildings up on the 7th floor. The sun shining in. It was hot like hell. I wasn't used to this. No air conditioning. We had a big furnace in the back, so the temperature probably was 110, 120 degrees in there. It was quite an experience. But the people were very nice, and they took me as a foreigner that had obvious language problems in, and were very friendly, and that was a very pleasant, nice surprise for me. I felt that this was not for me forever, so I took evening courses after work in the south side. Since the stockyards in the south side of Chicago, I took courses at the University of Chicago, and with Karash and Dura. And I lived on the north side of Chicago. It's a long hike, a long ride every day over an hour. And one day I attended a lecture series at Northwestern University. This Friday evening lectures. And I thought I might consider going back to school, but I didn't know how to go about it. So after one of the lectures, I walked up to the fellow who was apparently in charge of this affair and had introduced the speaker, and I chatted with him. It turned out it was Professor Robert Burwell, who at that time was chairman of the chemistry department. This was in 1954, in December. So I introduced myself and asked, what does it take to sign up and go back to school or so on? And he says, you want to come? We have an opening right now. Why don't you start right away? Right sight unseen after I told him just a little bit about myself and where I'd come from. So a week later I talked to my wife and see how she felt about it, because it meant going back to graduate school days, and I needed her full support for this, and she voluntarily greatly encouraged me to do so. So that is without that I couldn't have possibly done that. So I went back to graduate school and started in January, and in April I got my qualifiers done and all this kind of stuff that you have to do here. And then I started research, and I picked Herman Pines as my research advisor after I made the rounds, the customary rounds of the various professors. And I was attracted to Herman Pines for a number of reasons. He could offer me a scholarship, which was one of the conditions, but that was not the unique thing about Herman Pines. He struck me immediately as somebody who had enough, he had quite a bit of thorough knowledge, and it turned out to be right, immense knowledge in hydrocarbon chemistry. He had also had industrial experience, so he knew exactly how to do things that were important and what is important later on for industry. And he was a very kind man at the same time. And so this was some of the features that attracted me to work with him. And he turned out to be a very, very fortunate choice. I started to work on a project he gave me and says, we must study aluminas. And subsequently chromium alumina. And it was interesting. I started to say I knew nothing about these fields. I knew nothing about, specifically, no detailed knowledge in catalysis, having come from organometallic synthesis. I started to look into the literature, of course, to brush up. And he, after one day or so, and he said, you don't need to read all that, because most of what you read is wrong anyway, and it gives you the wrong mindset. So just go in and find out what you can find with a completely blank mind. You can read up later what others have done. That was his research philosophy. And I did read up a little more than he wanted me to. We read some very interesting old papers by Ginsfelder from Shell. And they did have some guiding force for me in the field of, at least in the field of chromium aluminas. But it turned out the work we could do in identifying different aluminas and of different acidities, and showing that just pure alumina has relatively good acid properties for acid catalyzed reactions, including paraffin's isomerization and not just the typical alcohol dehydration and so on. That turned out to be and apparently, which I didn't know at the time, something that wasn't generally recognized in industry. The big differences between different kinds of aluminas. Work in those times had been done with physisorption and chemisorption of amines and so on. And these techniques just were not quite as sensitive as the catalytic tests. And that's perhaps one of the things that has been with me ever since in my career, that the catalytic tests can be much more sensitive than physical methods of characterization that often do not see minority sites and often are misled by spectator properties and sites on the catalyst, that not always are then important in the catalytic action. So we had a good time at Northwestern. It was a lot of hard work, which suited me fine because I wanted to get out as quickly as possible. My family had tolerated the graduate student lifestyle long enough. But it was fun, of course. So we didn't have soft drinks, and we didn't have TV. We had a $20 radio, which my father-in-law gave me as for entertainment. And we had a lot of iced tea. And of course, I had to get used to the American lifestyle as well. Just in passing, my family reminds me of often sometimes how naive and unused to circumstances I was. I had never seen watermelons in my life, and when I got my first paycheck from Swift, which was at that time $100 a week, I came home from the elevator and I passed this jeweled food store, and they had these wonderful watermelons in the store window, and it says 4 cents a pound. So looking at my paycheck and the money I had just cashed, I said, I think I can afford that. So I went in and says, I want a pound to bring home to the family. And of course there was a funny look. And he says, we normally sell it by, maybe you can get half of one. So I sprung for half a watermelon at the time. Well, coming back to the times periods, we had a very dedicated research group, worked hard, and indication of that was I usually worked until 10 o'clock at night or so. And Herman Pines would sometimes come back. He was such a wonderful, generous man who really cared for his students. There was one outstanding feature apart from his scientific knowledge that he passed on. He would come by and says, so you're still doing distillations and so on, fine. What about taking a break? And come home with me, and I asked Mrs. Pines to fix you some sandwiches so you can continue to work better. And of course, Mrs. Pines always was a wonderful mother to the students at Northwestern. The other example comes to my mind from those days was one of the younger students there had gotten tickets to a football game, and I had never seen an American football game, of course. Heard about that this is different than European soccer, but had no idea what it was. So I was tempted to take the time off to go to a football game on a Saturday afternoon. And unlike normal practices where I worked until the evening, I told Professor Pines I would like to take off at about 1 o'clock to go to a football game. I could never forget his face. A world came crashing down on him. He says, you too? And I thought, you, of all people, don't waste your time with that kind of stuff. And I promised him I would do it only once. So I went up to the football game with that other fellow, and I found myself sitting in the cheering section, and the students, and we had to flip cards and all this. And of course I just followed and had no idea what this was all about. In the meantime, of course, I appreciated the finer points of football, at least to some extent, into United, but that was the introduction. And the one break that Herman Pines had to, the one thing that Herman Pines had to swallow, that even some of his, what he thought were his better students would go to a football game occasionally. So ultimately, then, when it was time to leave, I looked for a job, and finally decided, after taking some interview trips, decided to join the Mobil Oil Companies, which I did in January 2nd, 1959. And I've been with them ever since, for now over 34 years. 34 years, right. It was an interesting time. It was shortly after Sputnik. Science was valued all of a sudden, and was more prestigious in the United States. People looked up to the scientists to create a counterbalance to this apparent great scientific advance that the Russians were capable of, and shook everybody up. And many companies started to do research, establish research centers in the country those days, and value research a little more. And Mobil at that time had just a few years earlier rethought their approach to research. They had a consultant from Penn State, Professor Rob Schiesler, who had worked on the API project for a long time, a lot of time, and he was hired and agreed to run a new fundamental research department at Mobil, which at that time was Soconi Mobil. And he established a laboratory and a climate at which science was regarded very highly. And he saw to it that the scientists were respected and had a lot of freedom to do what they wanted. There was relatively little control from the top, except the control was to put the right people in place. And I remember even then, that was in Paulsboro, New Jersey, in the southern part of New Jersey opposite the Philadelphia airport. A very good climate. There were a lot of very interesting people there. They had hired a bunch of physicists, because after all, physicists were the ones that could develop an atomic bomb, and they were the truest scientists of all. And maybe they could revolutionize the science of petroleum reforming and refining. And so they hired a few of them, but they were very, very fortunate, because those that they did hire were good, not good physicists, but good scientists. There was Dwight Prater, who had worked on some aspects of the Manhattan Project. There was Jim White. Jim White had worked on some of the Manhattan Project. Dwight Prater didn't, but he worked on other aspects for the military. And Paul Weiss, whose background had been with Geiger in Germany, and who developed the Geiger counter, and he has done research in physics surrounding that aspect. So he came to Mobil, and what these people shared is, among themselves, they were not preoccupied with accepted knowledge. They tried to break through and look at things very differently. And they quickly, of course, found that needed to focus on what the company's problems was, and they did. They really didn't want to go out and establish themselves in a separate corner, but they were really proud of the company and tried to, whatever they could do, use their brain power, their interests, their incisive analytical capabilities to identify and real problem areas and also opportunities. And so it was in that climate that Paul Weiss particularly established, got fascinated with zeolites. And those that were available at the time were sodium X and sodium A zeolite. And these were salts. And classical scientists knew that you cannot tolerate salts in a catalyst. After all, when you put sodium on silica aluminum, you kill all the catalysts. So how can they possibly do any good? Nevertheless, the search began slowly and steadily in the laboratory to see if anything new could be found and could be developed from this. The regularity of the pore sizes and so on just was too tempting to ignore without really knowing what precisely might be the outcome of that. So I got in the ground floor of trying to come to grips with the problem of developing activity and acidity. I had another group leader, that was Vincent Fillet. He is not well known, but he really should, because he was a wonderful scientist. He came to Mobil having done work in polymers and in ion exchange membranes and printing inks, and he knew nothing about catalysis. By nothing we mean he was not familiar with all the established detailed knowledge. But he had a brilliant mind and knowledge of the fundamentals of research, the fundamental principles, the fundamental laws of physics and chemistry. And that just made it wonderful to together, to jointly with him, to just apply it and starting fresh, without any preconceived ideas. Out of this, we looked at modernite. We bought beach pebbles from Nova Scotia. Every time some of us, particularly Paul Weiss, made a trip, we roamed the back streets of Paris to little shops that sold mineral specimens and bought home Ulandite and sugar varolite and all kinds of samples, whatever was available, and we converted them to the ammonium form and the hydrogen form and see if there's any catalysis associated with things. And at that time, then, pretty soon came the work that led to the first catalytic cracking tests. When X was used, and then REX, and then later on the Y catalyst became available, and that led to this, the first use in catalytic cracking. At that time, our laboratory, about 1963, moved to Princeton, New Jersey. We established a new campus-like laboratory outside of Princeton, which was a customary thing to do. Exxon moved out of Clinton with their fundamental research lab, and many others did. I started at that time to have my own research ideas, and the company allowed me very much to pursue them. Again, Schiessler's philosophy was let people do their own, follow their own guidance and their own convictions, up to a point, of course. But he gave a lot of leeway to new ideas. And at that time, I pursued, and was allowed to, pursue the idea of trying to bridge the gap between man-made catalysts and the catalysts of the nature in the enzymes. We looked at properties and trying to understand why enzymes have such a high activity. And what is it about it? Is it the protein structure, the three-dimensional structure? Is it just the active sites? We learned that the activation energy of enzyme catalyzed reactions is not very different from very simple analogs. Isolated from all the biological surroundings that the enzyme is at. So it wasn't any particular new trick that the enzymes that the nature uses. They use the same kind of chemistry. However, what we could do is what happens in nature is the pre-adsorption phenomenon that concentrates certain reactants specifically. That leads to higher rates. Now, in addition to the detailed structural environment, of course, leads also to the great selectivity of enzymes. What we tried to do is we could learn from that to some extent and see if we cannot develop some completely new enzymes, new catalysts in the laboratory. So, in order to do this, I started out using organic polymers, polystyrene particularly, that we could then modify and put all kinds of functional groups on the polymers to see if we can bridge the gap also not only between enzymes and man-made catalysts, but also between homogeneous catalysis that at that time had been highly developed, and heterogeneous catalysis. And of course, at Northwestern we had people like Basolo and Pearson that had done a tremendous amount of wonderful work with homogeneous catalysts, and I brought a lot of knowledge and background with me from Northwestern at the time. And so it was interesting to see if we could see what the difference is between homogeneous and heterogeneous catalysis, and if we could not heterogenize some of these groups that are swimming around in solution and see if we could benefit from that. So that led to work with functionalizing polystyrenes, with phosphine groups on the polystyrene and nitrogen and sulfur groups as potential polymeric ligands to which could be then attached transition metals, platinum, rhodium, and palladium, and osmium. And we had a whole variety of different catalysts, of course, made, and then each one would be tested for a variety of different reactions. So that was a very fruitful endeavor. We learned the principles involved, and ultimately could show there is really no big difference between in rates and activity, whether the functional groups have been heterogenized, being part of a heterogeneous catalyst, or whether they were in solutions. And that was also then the first time I had to confront myself and appreciate what needs to be done in industry if you have fundamental principles. You have to look at the practical aspects and see, so now we can do it, but what is the consequences for process technology in terms of cost, handling, scale up, temperature control, and so on. We found that the heterogeneous catalysts could well be handled. They are more concentrated, there's a higher density inside, so fitting the reactor than the highly diluted homogeneous catalysts. On the other hand, they have perhaps lifetime problems, depending on what it is. And so we found the pros and cons. The work particularly important was the work we could do on the OXO reaction together with a co-worker of mine, Dwayne Whitehurst. We synthesized a variety of resins based on rhodium, and could identify activities and selectivities for the hydroformylation reactions of different olefins. And these were among the first first cases of a whole large group of heterogenized transition metal catalysts for which we got a variety of very basic patterns in their synthesis and applications. I, at the same time, work on zeolites progressed very much at Mobil. I tried to steer away from this because it became a bandwagon effect. Everybody jumped in, and I thought there must be something else to do outside of the zeolites. So I pursued the work on the heterogeneous transition metals and then a variety of other things like oxidative dehydrogenation using carbonyl, or paraffins to olefins using carbonyl sulfides, and free radical chemistry, gas phase chemistry, homogeneous chemistry. And finally, when CSM5 came along, that is a new zeolite that was not available previously to that. It had particular pores of only, it's a medium pore zeolite, in contrast to the large pore and the small pore zeolites that were available prior to this. Then the need to do a lot of work quickly came about. It was in this time when Heinz Heinemann was head of our catalysis research section, and he had the great foresight to see the tremendous potential that this zeolite might offer. We had enough clues from small test reactions left and right that led him to say we must try really make a concentrated effort on a broad front to delineate all the properties, delineate all the opportunities that the zeolite might offer. So task forces were formed who looked at different aspects of the catalyst: paraffin reaction, aromatics reaction, dehydrocyclizations, isomerizations of aromatics and of paraffins, and they were assigned to different groups, and we had weekly group meetings where they all got together and wrote weekly minutes on it in a very concentrated effort. And cannot overemphasize the importance that Heinz Heinemann played in those days to put the emphasis on the work, which he did in a wonderful way. He just allowed every group a lot of freedom to investigate what they wanted within those areas, and yet had a joint focus. And that was quite productive. In short time, we had a good mapping out of the field of applicability of CSM5. Research questions nevertheless came along, like that were a little bit outside of the primary objectives of an oil companies, such as like other acid catalysts. CSM5 was very good to dehydrate alcohols. And if you have ethanol, you get ethylene and water, of course. But the question then that a curious researcher always says, what happens if dehydration, if the hydrogen and the OH group are not in two adjacent carbon atoms that you eliminate to form water, but they are in the same carbon atom, like in benzyl alcohol or in methanol. So the curiosity of the researcher drove that research, and colleagues, Warren Kading and later on Clarence Chang, pursued the reaction. And I guess it was Tony Silvestri and Clarence Chang that focused on developing this, searching more for answers from methanol conversions. Ultimately, out of this came then the somewhat famous MTG process, methanol to gasoline, that was again recognized by Heinz Heinemann to may have some commercial value. Now this was not a very easily accepted research area at our company. There were a lot of people that who ever heard of converting methanol to gasoline. So since we haven't heard of it, it cannot be of much value. But Heinz had the broad knowledge and the instincts of pursuing this. And it was just at the time in the oil crisis, the first oil crisis that hit us in the early 70s, that one desperately was looking for alternatives to gasoline, independent of the conventional petroleum raw material basis. And so methanol, which was available either from coal or from natural gas, looked like it as a very attractive pathway, as an intermediate to get gasoline, which we could get in this MTG process. It makes a gasoline that is very much the same as we have always used. And he led the effort and to do all the necessary laboratory and development work, and that ultimately, with pilot plant work in Portsmouth and so on, led to the construction of the first MTG process in New Zealand, which even today is operative and supplies about 1/3 of the gasoline needs of New Zealand. It's under normal circumstances, of course, not competitive with today's petroleum prices, but after the plant has been written off and the investment has been recovered, just based on their operating costs alone, is doing very nicely. And it's still, there's no need to shut that down because the operating costs are not that much great once you have recovered your catalyst cost. So after that period of the initial very exciting exploratory research in zeolites area, came a time of looking more at practical problems, focusing on certain areas that had immediate impact for the company. And I was involved with research in many aspects of that work, some of catalytic dewaxing and particularly in the petrochemical applications in the xylene isomerization, in ethylbenzene synthesis, and toluene disproportionation. And again, the research atmosphere was such that I was allowed to pick my own research areas, try to identify new aspects, and was allowed to work on that. And ultimately, it led to the applications of these processes to many commercial processes. And many plants have been built in the world, of course, for doing xylene isomerization. About 18 or 19 plants, world plants to make ethylbenzene. And xylene isomerization is of course very large. I mentioned that. It was an interesting combination of doing fundamental work and applied work. And I have never regretted having doing this kind of work. Basically, I'm very interested in mechanisms and fundamental aspects of reactions, but not for their own sake. And this is something I perhaps have to give credit to the whole environment at Mobil, and in very particular to to Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss had the interesting combination of and the unique capability of spotting, doing fundamental research and spotting opportunities and seeing principles in the catalytic research that could be applied to other areas. Perhaps that's a dominant property and characteristics of his, to see principles in one field and applying them to other areas. He's almost unique in this regard, in this capability. He's doing it now after his retirement and applying fundamental principles from diffusion properties and applying it to medical research for cancer, and which he identified as being diffusion limited, and provided solutions to it in a highly successful cooperative effort with the Harvard Medical School. So it is this kind of stretching your mind and just looking for it for applications that really is something I had a chance to appreciate in those days and become familiar with. And it is perhaps one of the characteristics of research that we could do that was with a relatively small base of people in the laboratory, a very narrow, small group of people, we could be relatively successful in the whole industry. I've often been asked, how come that Mobil has come up with so many new processes relative in the last few years, and what does it take to be successful in industry? Particularly the Japanese people had sponsored a workshop they invited me to attend of how do you reconcile doing fundamental research in industry. Because after all, fundamental research costs money and is not directly leading to applications. And it is probably the philosophy of Paul Weiss that I would have to cite here as a solution to do fundamental research in industry. If it's fundamental research, not for its own sake, but in the truest sense of the word, there is a fundament to build on. And it's only when you build something and a foundation that the foundation is useful. So you lay a basis where it's needed, and then you build on it or induce others to build on it and utilize it. And so it's this directed fundamental research in the appropriate way, having the good judgment to use what to do, what kind of fundamental research to do that is pertinent, that leads to successes in industry. And that gets tolerated and paid for because and continues to be supported by industry, which is not often the case if you do a lot of fundamental research and the managers after some time decides what have we gotten out of it. That leads often to the disenchantment of fundamental research and cutbacks. It was also then that in the same vein, that I learned to appreciate the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Now, efficiency is something to do a job right, to do something right. And we are highly trained in university and to learn how to do things right, to do experiments right, to use the right kind of thinking, the right approach. Effectiveness, however, is do the right thing, knowing what to do. That goes beyond just doing things right. And that multiplies your effort and tries to find the right basis for it that can bring food. And that's what is often not quite required from academic research. To pick and choose those areas of research that are most urgently needed and supply the fundamental knowledge in that particular specific area. It is something that attracted me personally very much, because also contacts I had with other colleagues at Mobil, like N.Y. Chen, chemical engineer, from whom I learned really to get a little engineering thinking in my work. I didn't get carried away with being the fundamental chemist that is more interested in molecules than in making money. And there's no conflict in my mind to combine the two. You still can be interested in molecular events and molecular thinking if you apply it to the right kind of process and so on. That makes engineering sense, and then one can and should do fundamental research in that area. And this has been perhaps one of the things I can really pass on, have appreciated over the years. That combination, doing really fundamental research in an industrial environment and doing it reasonably with fun and with occasionally commercial success. I think that's probably enough I want to say.
Well, I have several.
Well, when I was about 16 years old and still, of course, going to high school, the German government decided they had to draft more and more youngsters. And at the age of 16, of course, you couldn't be drafted into the army. So they established an Air Force Auxiliary Corps, which consisted of taking 16-year-olds and gave them a 2 months training in manning anti-aircraft guns, at flak. And so we got a 2 months basic training, and we went to a location where we could practice for the first time with live ammunition and shooting at a balloon that was dragged behind an aircraft, and we tried to hit that balloon and not the aircraft with our. And I was at a 2 centimeter small gun. That was so a group of us were then assigned after that training to be stationed in the top of one of the big grain elevators. They had built a platform on top of the roof, just big enough for our little gun, and 7 of us, and we were directed by a sergeant, and we slept there. Directly on the top floor of that grain elevator, they had some bunk beds, and that was our accommodations. And that lasted for a year. We went to school in the morning from 8 till 12, and then we came back to our station, and there were a few others in the area where we were. We had lunch, and then afterwards we had exercises and cleaned the gun and did the normal things that military people do. And then we slept there. Next morning we took our bicycles again and rode to school. So that went on for about 2 years.
What city was this in?
That was in my hometown, which was called Heilbronn. Heilbronn is situated between Heidelberg and Stuttgart on the Neckar Valley. And we went to our home to our normal school, same school building. Quite often schooling was interrupted by an advanced alarm in English or American. Planes flew over the France towards Germany, and so we were put on alarm. We rushed to our stations, and one fellow watched this guy with binoculars, and we were at the ready, and of course we had to take the time. There was nothing else to do except wait, and often the planes didn't come in our direction, but we had to be at the ready. So one of them we would do our homework at the time. And for instance, the next day we had a Latin examination, so he would read the words and the vocabulary, and we would go through them and practice our Latin words, while one fellow was watching this guy and the others was at the ready to shoot any time it was necessary. That was an interesting situation. That lasted 2 years. The first year we were the novices, and the second year we were assigned to be in charge of the next year's crop of auxiliary students, which we were then the old timers with 17. After that, but we considered it, as part of the duty to defend our country, and only once did we saw real action where we had to try to prevent an attack, bombing attack on the hometown. We did manage to fire at an American plane, and we got half credit for downing one. But there were, of course, bombing attacks on the town every once in a while, and like everywhere else, of course. And eventually the town was hit very hard. They lost, I guess, 10,000 people out of 40,000 in half an hour. Towards the end of the war, that was in December 44. And at the time when the war neared its end, and bombing raids of that kind were carried out, I guess to break the final resistance of the home front. Of course, it wasn't anything that didn't go on both sides. And Coventry had happened quite a few years earlier in England, where the town was decimated by German attacks.
How did it strike a person in their teens to be going to school in the morning and be going to military in the afternoon?
Well, like everything in the war, if it's blended in slowly, it's amazing what one can get used to. The whole very greatly different lifestyle we had to live would have been impossible to imagine if it hadn't suddenly all at once. But it started gradually. There was one air raid, for instance, as an example, and we all had to rush to the air raid shelters. Alternatively, we fortified our cellar with beams and put bunk beds up and straw mattresses, and just we went down there and continued to sleep. And it was occasionally, and then it was more often, and eventually it was almost every second day, and so we spent the night in the cell. And you get used to it. It's amazing what human beings can tolerate once they gradually get adapted to it. The survival instinct is so great that you can accept all kinds of things. Oh, you don't have enough to eat. You have 100 grams, which is less than a quarter of a pound of meat per week assigned to it on your ration cards. So you just do without it. And the people have recipe books for making potatoes 50 different ways, and for instance, and so on. So human nature is of that kind that one can adapt to all kinds of things. We didn't think much of it. There was some fun aspects associated with doing this. When we really were not prepared for an examination in school, we had some tests and so on. At one time, I remember we just didn't feel like taking the test, so all the people in the class that were assigned to this duty, not all of them were, because some of them were not capable of serving. We all complained to the teacher we couldn't possibly hold a pen because we had gotten vaccinations the day before and all our arms were swollen. I mean, this is what young people do to cope with it, and they just shake everything else off and make the best of it. There was no, it was interesting. We felt kind of special and proud of doing this, and schooling was still try to keep up with schooling. So it's nothing. We didn't think anything unusual happened.
Now, did you wear uniform in the afternoon?
Uniform, yes. We were some kind of a uniform, which was not the normal military uniform. They tried to distinguish us clearly from the military. Was some auxiliary corps kind of thing. Yes, we wore uniform, and we had inspections, and we had some kind of a little drills occasionally. And so.
And how was food distribution handled at that time?
Well, while we were in this, we were of course fed by the military organizations. Although they had arranged with some local company who was in the area to use their cafeteria, and they paid them, and so on. We used the facilities of a manufacturing company who was in the area central to where all the guns were stationed to handle that. Food in general, of course, was getting scarcer and scarcer. And it was at that time that most of the people really rediscovered their love for their relatives who happened to live on a farm. And every Sunday and Saturday you saw the trains full of people with backpacks and so on, and taking the train and going in the countryside and walking 4 or 5 miles like I did too, of course. When I was a student later on as well, after the war even. And I visited my country relatives and came home with 10 eggs and a pound of butter or so on, which was very, very precious at the time. Sure.
Now, were there girls in the school that you attended, or was it all male?
No, we were separated. We were separated. It was an all-male school. As I mentioned earlier, it was what is called Oberschule or Gymnasium, and that started at age 10, 5th grade, through at that time 12th grade. We had very highly qualified teachers. Most of them had their PhDs in their specialties. Maybe 90% had a PhD. Even our art teacher had a PhD in art. And the physicist who taught us physics and math, he was a highly qualified man who served as consultant to one of to NSU, which was the company that laid an automobile and motorcycle manufacturer to solve special mathematical problems they couldn't handle. It's the company that later on developed also the Wankel engine, the rotary engine, and so on. And he found solutions to math problems. They didn't know how to handle it. So that's the kind of teachers we have. The English teacher, of course, had a PhD in modern languages. He had to have spent 2 years in England before he was qualified to teach English. And so, and of course that was very typical for the school. We also emphasized at that time, of course, sports. We had to have sports at least one hour a day. And that's something I personally got involved very much. After I had some hip problems as a youngster when I was 19 years old, after that healed up, then I got very interested in sports, and I was in a track team in high school, and made it to the state championships and so on, board jumping, and we had a 100-meter relay I was involved in and so on. So that sports were highly regarded at the time. Of course, it was part of the whole image of training a sound mind in a healthy body, the old Greek idea. That was very prevalent.
What did your father do?
My father was a baker. He has a bakery and pastry store. And of being the only son, of course, he always had wanted me to take over what he had built up, a very successful business. And at the same time, he felt if I could lead an easier life than he had to do to struggle, he wouldn't want to stand in my way. So I know his inside he wanted badly, and his heart was such that he wanted me badly to take over and work with him. But his mind and his reason was gracious enough to allow me to do what I wanted. He neither discouraged or encouraged me to go to university. He had perhaps been advised or told by some of my teachers that they thought I might want to go to college and not go and become a baker, where you had to get up at 4 o'clock every morning and at 2 o'clock on Fridays and Saturdays. And I did help out during the time when I came back from after the war. When I couldn't go immediately into college, I started helping out in a bakery shop and acquired a certain knowledge of how to bake bread, which I do occasionally once or twice a year. So he was not the driving force for me to go to college, but he really was quite supportive in general.
And his business stayed in operation during the war?
Oh yes, oh yes, very much so. Yes.
And how would he acquire supplies?
Well, that was tough, of course. Everything was with ration cards. The people came to the store and they got ration cards with coupons attached. And if they wanted a loaf of bread, they gave us a coupon that says 500 grams, which is about a pound of bread, and they would get that pound of bread, and we had to take these coupons. And the war years, we all spent all our Fridays and Saturday nights and Sundays taking all these coupons and sorting them out that we took in. And would paste them and usually in newspapers, whole newspaper page, all hundreds of them had to be pasted up so they could be readily controlled, and with one look you could see these were a few hundred, and then you turned those in to some agency and they write your permit to purchase the equivalent amount of flours that went into this many pieces of bread you sold. Or if you wanted to have a roll, they had 50 grams coupons that were hundreds and thousands to sort into. So we had been friends, and all the family got together, 4 or 5 people and so on, and spent 3-4 hours every Saturday and Sundays to paste them up. And then you could go to the miller and say, here, I have sold so much bread, I get now a permit to purchase 50 bags of flour, and that's the way it was handled. And it was the same with sugar and fat. And so if somebody bought pastry roll, he had to give 50 grams worth of flour and 10 grams of fat and 5 grams of sugar or whatever coupons, depending on what it was, and then we had to convert those in a painful operation and time-consuming to these drawing rights so you could purchase again.
Now, were you living there aware that news and that sort of thing might have been distorted, or was this also gradual? And
it was also gradual, but we, being isolated from the rest of the world, we didn't know if it was distorted. At least the youngsters were not. Older people that had lived at times before that, of course, they had a slightly different perspective. They didn't take everything without a grain of salt. We youngsters, as young people often are, were idealistic, and we didn't know any better. And we accepted what we were told mostly, because it was all embracing. Everything was just one-sided. The teachers in school, the newspapers, all the people that we normally respected of authority were all along the same lines, and so you had no way of knowing any different, except my old grandmother and my parents. They were sort of cool about all these glorious times that we were facing. My father was too busy to do his job, to be really politically committed one way or another. And he just gave up and concentrated on his work. My grandmother was always somebody who says, well, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do this, and so on, because that's just not right. And, when it came to taking treatment, for instance, with the Jewish people. And I had just learned in school, from my teachers that there are, and I remember this very vividly. We had one particular teacher who really was making propaganda. He told us there are good and bad horses. Like my grandmother was telling me, there are good people on both sides and so on. So he had told us there are good and bad horses, but there are only bad lice or rats. And when I repeated that to what I had just learned in school to my grandmother, she got so angry with me, and I took a whipping from her. That gave me to thinking an awful lot. And we formed had our own reservations even then, at the age of 16, 17. Especially that teacher we didn't take him seriously. That was the propagandist in school. He was not the brightest person, and we had no respect for him. And that helped us to think a little deeper occasionally, except there was no support for any other kind of thinking. So, and all these political issues were really overwhelmed by the apparent need to defend the country during the war. There was no stepping back and says, should we be in a war or not? It was just once it started and once it took over. And by that time I was only 13 years when the war started. After then it had been progressed for a few years. There was just one way to save your hide and to come out without being completely defeated and crushed. So that was the overriding concern. And everything else, any moral or political questions or so on, had not much room.
Now, when you got drafted, how long were you in training?
Well, first, before I was drafted to the army, I served in what is called in German Arbeitsdienst. That was sort of a labor corps. That was a pre-military organization, mostly devoted to do kind of construction work and similar things, drilling ditches where it was needed and all this kind of thing. That was, and that was still a paramilitary organization in the sense that we had some kind of a brown uniforms. We had were trained in the normal drill routine, the basic training does, and marching, and to a small extent. But basically, we had pickle and shovel and pickaxes, and we were drilling, excavating manually a giant swimming pool type of basin to collect water near a hospital. There was a hospital in the area. And this was in the Saar district, incidentally. I was away from home for 3 months. What we had to do typically, there were 100 people, and we had to provide a reservoir for water in case of an air attack. So they didn't run out of water, they could pump it and against fire, of course. And so 300 people just spent a few weeks and dug this shovel all manually and wheelbarrows, and so they could put water in, and they had it at their disposal. So that's the kind of work that was done, among other things. And then I joined as I said, the army in summer '44, and yeah, we had our basic training. About 2 months, and then we went to some training grounds in a very harsh environment. It was winter, it was muddy. We had to march and drill ditches again, defensive ditches there even. It was very rough. It was maybe the roughest time I had in my life out. We were cold. We had to march 15 kilometers every day to the side and spend the day there, come home and clean up and try to sew up some wood and make a fire in the oven to warm up a little bit. And it was very cold, and food was not very good. It was tough. And then I went to the officers' school, where we were trained as officers after half a year in the service. And that was in early '45. After 6 weeks there, we were almost ready to be shipped into action and so on. There was an air raid on the town we were stationed in. Our troop of about 30 people, we were about 7-8 miles outside doing military practice. And interestingly, it was an overcast day, and we heard the planes flying over us, and we were not concerned because we were isolated in a field far away from anything else. And all of a sudden, bombs started to come down on us. And I could never understand why that happened. Perhaps talking since with other people, American flyers, they said, well, if they missed their target or whatever, they just dropped the bombs anywhere because they didn't want to come home loaded up. First of all, they used more fuel, and secondly, well, they might have had to do an accounting why they didn't drop it or so on. So they just dropped it, and it must have been just a very random and highly improbable occurrence that they dropped it just where our troop was. And it was from our 30 people, about 20 died. And all the rest was more or less heavily wounded, and I got away with just a light shrapnel through my leg. And of course that put me in the hospital because I couldn't put a boot on, and was unsuitable for military action.
And what town was this close to?
This was south of Stuttgart, a small town, Reutlingen, near between Stuttgart and Tübingen, and where they had a big barracks and so on for training. And so that put me in the hospital, which was interesting in itself because it was an emergency hospital set up in some high school, and it was for lightly wounded people and people that were on the way to being no longer needed intensive care. Of course, that was a very interesting situation there. We were isolated. We saw the end of the war coming, and we found an old piano on the top floor under the roof of that high school, and we found one person who was a gifted piano player. And so together with some nurses and some of us, about 6, 7, went up there, and he played to us Moonshine Sonata, and so it was a wonderful situation to see, the misery all around you, and yet here there was some values that beauty and permanence that we cherished very much, that we felt would endure for everyone. So,
Now, how
there were troops, as the troops retreated, when the French and American soldiers broke through across the Rhine. Troops retreated there, and many of them were wounded by low-flying airplanes that strafed them. And they were rushed to our hospital. Now, the doctors at that hospital, they were former gynecologist and so on. He hadn't done any surgery in 30, 40 years, except when he was in school, I guess. And he suddenly had to amputate legs and take care of heavily wounded. And of course, they always needed the blood supply wasn't there, so they asked for volunteers. And I remember one day when I volunteered, and they matched my blood with somebody else, and they did a blood transfusion directly. It was a miserable situation because they had a three-way valve. They sucked out with a syringe and the T was connecting us. They sucked it out and they changed the valve and pumped it into him and out from me and into him. And it all was clogged because they didn't have any anti-clotting devices. So they had to try again, and the needle was always getting clogged up. So it took forever and ever to get that poor fellow a little blood from me. And after I had done this, they asked me to just sit there for a little while. And then the lights went out, and they had artificial lights, so they asked me if I could help. So I was standing there and holding the lantern, electric, big flashlight kind of thing, to aid while they were doing the operations. Later on, they asked me to hold the leg of the fellow that they were going to sew with a saw, with a hand saw, and sew up and amputate it. And so I spent many a day there in operating group. And after everything was done, and then the poor nurses, they had to clean up the floor and the floor, so I volunteered to help them a little bit until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And so it was an interesting experience at the time. Get involved in that.
Now, how was the surrender or the capture arranged?
Well, we were, in my case, this was very fortunate. I was in the hospital. We had a red flag outside. All the guns had been, from the people that came in, had been collected, had been locked in a room, and so French troops came in, and they just marched in, and they saw it was a hospital. They went through the rooms, and some doctor came along and checked out that everything was okay. and all of a sudden the front had moved through that town, and we were all of a sudden behind, on the other side of the battlefront. It was actually a great letdown on the one hand, but we saw it coming, so it was more a sign of relief. I remember very much the feeling I had earlier, where we always were really concerned, even at the home front, with air raid attacks. And I remember very vividly one day saying, if I ever live to see the day where I don't hear an airplane and have to be afraid that it may come down on me, that will be the most wonderful thing in life, and I can wish for anything else more in life than just this happening. There could be nothing else ever happening to me that make me dissatisfied with living, if I can live without that constant fear. That's just more than most people felt that way, because it was just a part of the symptom. How do you cope with a war-like situation? It creeps up on you slowly, and you just accept it as part of the world, and you're living slowly. And you don't wake up every day to be unhappy about it. That's just what life from now on is. So you accept it, and life goes on. You find little pleasures in other things, like sitting at a darkened, without any lights in a room, in the attic of that room, and listen to somebody playing the piano. It was some of the very precious moments you can always make for yourself.
So that bombing just makes it uncomfortable, but doesn't put you in submission.
No. I thought about this when Americans tried to bomb Hanoi and try to break the resistance and build to resist. I always felt this. How can that be? These people just get angrier and just get their will to resist just goes up. I mean, it doesn't usually, unless it's very severe and it's at an advanced stage, break a country and change the will to resist or so. You just accept it, and as part of the suffering you have to take, and there's a lot one can take. That's how the people in East Germany survived for 60 years under that regime, or 50. You just accept it. That's the way things are now.
What did women do in Germany during the war? Were they physical labor, or were they?
Many worked in, many more than before worked in factories, yes. And they had to do a lot of the men's jobs, of course. In the farms particularly, there where men were scared, women had to do an increasing amount of farm labor, manual labor, taking care of the animals and plowing the fields and so on. And in the cities as well. They were organizing to collect woolen blankets for the troops that were in Russia and were freezing to death there, or were sewing things, those that didn't work. So they were all called upon to contribute. I gave up a pair of skis I had, which as a result, as a request to donate our skiing equipment, because apparently the troops on the Eastern Front needed this. I'm not sure how much they could really take advantage of it. So women did work in factories, sure, but to a greater extent.
Now, after the war was over, there was a period where politics was a hot topic in that at least the communists were trying to establish. In high school age, were you aware of this, or was? We
were under the in the American zone, my hometown, where the American troops had stationed. And the only danger communism provided for us was military takeover. There was the great danger and fear that not perhaps the political agenda, but just political forces would overrun Western Europe. They had been victorious in the war after they recovered. That was a constant fear that everybody had, that the Americans would not be able to or willing to defend Western Europe, and the communists would Russia in those days would overrun Western Europe. That was a constant fear, and it showed itself in many aspects. And even until a short while ago, before the breakup of the Russian, many people had gold coins in their hands, and I know Swiss people, it says, my father-in-law, one of my sons, married a Swiss girl. He's a banker in Zurich. And he advised his daughter and his daughter-in-law and advised me to always have a certain amount of your wealth in gold and in small pieces. So you can always go to the countryside and buy some food from farmers. And that necessity to prepare for that kind of situation is still existing somewhat in Europe. Although right now, of course, after the last events of the last 2-3 years, it probably is diminishing very rapidly. But until then it was. I had a schoolmate that was just after the war, about 1947, 48, 49. He, whenever I visited him in my hometown, he says he always showed me with pride. In his garage, he had about 6 to 8 canisters of gasoline, always filled up. He says, this is here when the Russians are coming, I'm taking off. I'm going out towards France and Spain. And he had prepared, he had a cottage somewhere in the Alps that was stocked with supplies. And he kept it always up. And quite many people had at least the feeling and even did similar preparations. So that was always with many people. It died slowly, that fear. So it lasted until throughout the 50s and the early 60s. So that was the fear of being just militarily overrun. And it only slowly gave way to slow assurance that NATO would defend Western Europe.
Now, before you left Germany, was there a local awareness that Germany was being divided east and west, or did that just gradually happen?
Oh, that had happened, of course, already when the wall went up.
Mm-hmm.
In Berlin. It was a very traumatic experience. Actually, just going back a little bit, right after the war, when German soldiers were tired, some of them had fought for 5-6 years, and many died and been wounded, and so everybody was tired of the war and was glad it was over. However, there was always one common theme. He says, if the Americans would turn now towards the communism, we would all volunteer and go with them. They would all start all over again and fight the Russians. Of course, America was not politically inclined and even in a position to do that, and of course. But that was the great hope, that we would turn around and then fight communism. They had no real qualms against England or French or Americans, not to the same extent, but the Russians, they were really worth doing it all over again. Finding them.
Now, what determined priorities of going to college after the war was over? You said there were priorities and you had to wait a while.
Yeah, of course, the colleges got flooded with applicants. And the priorities were those people that had veterans, basically. Some of them had joined the army in 1937 to do their military duty for 2 years. And by 1939, when they were just time to get home, the war started. So those that worked with, survived all the time, some of them served from 1937 till 1945. There had been 8 years. Mm-hmm. And some 7 and 6 and 5 and 4. So there were many, many years, of course, of accumulated the delayed college attendance by those people, and they got first crack at going to college. So I had to wait a little bit until 47.
Now, did most of the universities survive intact physically, or were they just faculty and teach wherever you could?
I don't have a good picture how it was overall. Most of them did survive. Perhaps they were usually located in smaller towns, and they were preserved. Like Heidelberg, wasn't hit at all. Tübingen was not hit at all. Heidelberg was, of course, earmarked for being military headquarters for the American troops, so they preserved that for that reason, presumably. And so physically they were mostly intact, but that was about it. Of course, classes were then really full. I mean, the general chemistry course, which was the highlight, Wittig taught that himself. That was his privilege to take the introductory chemistry course. And Kossel, the Nobel laureate in physics, taught the introductory physics course. It was almost 2 hours twice a week, from 8 till 10. And the classrooms were jammed full. I mean, there were people sitting on the window sills and on the steps and crowding around the front. And so the point we wanted to make was there was a lot of priorities given to those. In chemistry, the tempo of advancement, there's no, the system there is quite different than here. You don't have yearly exams also, or quizzes, usually at all. You just study, and when you are ready, you go to the professor and says, I think I'm ready for my first exam. And this is usually an oral exam, which is called a 4 diploma, which you take after 2 or 3 years in college attendance. You have to pass some examination. That's all over. You have to go to the professor and says, okay, I want you to show up next Friday, and you get dressed in your black suit and wear a white shirt and a tie, and you show up at 8 o'clock. And you spend an hour with one professor, and he asks you whatever he wants. And then you go on to the inorganic professor, and he asks you whatever he wants, and then the analytical professor, and then the physical chemist. And you have a discussion with them, and you either pass or don't. So that's a very, very interesting thing. And but other than that, you have to do a lot of experimental work in the laboratory, a lot of laboratory courses. And the lab was really the limiting reagent here. That was the bottleneck, because to get a place to do your work. And it was full-time laboratory work. That was the main thing you did. And you just take time off to go to classes. And you have to, let's say in organic chemistry, you have to prepare 36 different preparations, starting from making bromobenzene, by brominating benzene and distilling it and turning it in, and do a little write-up about this whole class of reactions at the same time. To, at the end, you have to do maybe polystep synthesis, including some 9-step synthesis of some alkaloids or whatever. That was the main part that slowed you down. And I couldn't get a lab space assigned to me to do that, because that was the limiting step. So you could advance it by helping out in the stockroom and making one normal HCl and and selling distilled water to the students that they had to pay for it. And one day I joined a group of us. We went into the forest to cut down some trees and saw it up and load it on trucks and bring it back to the professor's home. And in the next few days we just sawed it in small pieces and with an axe split it, and so we had some firewood. That kind of thing you had to do. And then once you had done it for a year or so, you get a little bit ahead in the queue and could advance your stuff. So these were the kind of working conditions there.
Now,
I took a time while I did not get my working place at the laboratory. I had a little more time, so I audited a whole variety of courses. I was just apparently very thirsty for anything. I took courses in anatomy and in psychology and in botanic and zoology and graphology and art appreciation and so on. Whatever was offered that I thought might be interesting. So I attended the courses from about 8 hours a day for a while.
was there the equivalent of the GI Bill for German soldiers?
I don't think quite. No, I don't think they got any financial aid. There was no money. It wasn't like here. The only advantage they had is they got in earlier. That's about all. They got admission earlier. But there was no other support available. But that's not saying too much because tuition was very low. Anyway, it was almost for free. And the only real expenses was finding a room to live in, and because they didn't have dormitories at all. So we went to the town and knock on doors and see if somebody would rent you a room and so on. You have to find that. And food was relatively inexpensive. They had some kind of soup kitchen type of mass supplies of food, so you could get it very cheap there. So you didn't need much money.
Now, did Wittig teach during the war, or?
I suppose so. I mean, I joined his laboratory in 47, the fall, so 48, 49. Yes, he was teaching, of course, all the time. And, he was an interesting fellow. He never had a car. He didn't want a car. What does he do with a car? You know, he's a chemistry professor. You don't need a car to teach chemistry. His hobbies were playing the piano and mountain hiking. He, together with Ziegler of Ziegler-Natta stream, were climbing quite a few mountains with rope and in their earlier days. So that's what his love was. And every year, Christmas, he got a calendar from the students showing the Matterhorn, and he always got the same calendar. So what he did with his students, once a month he would hike through the woods to a little country inn that was somewhere about 6-7 kilometers away, and we would hike through the woods to that there, and then we had some apple cider and some local sausage or whatever, and so that's what he believed in, apart from playing his piano on Sunday mornings.
Now, how did his research group get assignments? Did he give them, or did he?
Oh yes, yeah. He was in complete control of all the projects. Absolutely. Yes. And he had worked earlier in my example. He had worked on ylids derived from quaternary ammonium compounds and Stevenson rearrangements by metallizing quaternary compounds and oxonium compounds. And then he went to phosphonium compounds, so that was a big thing. And many research studies were never published. You were lucky if you get one publication out of it. It's very typical, of course, for the German system of those days. There was no pressure to publish. He could take on research areas that were very risky, and there was no way of knowing whether you would get anything decent out of it. But just advancing science in an area where there was high risk. And I often contrast these two of much of what has to be done, I guess, in the American system. You have to do something where there's a reasonable chance of success, I would think. And so much of the work is duplicated. So there's one more paper being done on methane dimerization. And how many papers are being written on that? And it's easy. You just use the same lanthanum catalyst or whatever and just use another alkali metal and put something else on it or do some other modifications. And, one cannot be critical of this because sometimes you have some very special notion about that and then it may well lead to an advance. But it's not often very innovative, although a lot of good thinking goes into it. But it's not the high-risk kind of very new avenues that are getting going. And this is just a result of the whole funding situation we have here. The German system, of course, the professor got full tenure, and he can do what he wants, and it's completely, once he's a point that he is completely independent of how much he publishes. This is his own decision.
Now, did Wittig have people between him and the student, or did he work directly with the student?
He worked directly with the student. He had some assistants. As I say, he had about 30 graduate students. He had some assistants that took care of the undergraduate laboratory experimentation, and they were quizzing them, and they had to. There was this structure there, and they assigned the undergraduate work. But for the graduate students, Wittig himself took care of everybody. So he said he worked around twice a day, and if he had thought he had a new compound and you just showed it to him, it was impure, then he would ask you to take a watch glass and a glass rod and a battery of solvents which you had to have ready, and he tried to crystallize it better and so on. And he used up, and you had to have spatulas and watch glasses and solvents all available for him when he showed up. And then he left you with all that mess he created, and then you had to clean up after him, and 3 hours or 5 hours later he came again and says, now have you tried that, and have you recrystallized the whole thing? And so that was the kind of reaction that he did. So he took a very great personal interest in it. He was, with that phosphine methylene synthesis method, he was consultant to Bardiche aniline and soda, BASF. And he showed him some of the early results my colleague and I had obtained, and they were quite enthusiastic about it. Perhaps typical for the German university system was the fact that they filed patents on it, and prior to this I had told to Wittig, in order to metallize the quaternary phosphonium compounds, we used always butyllithium or phenylithium, using a strong base to accept that take a weak proton, or abstract that from the quaternary compound to make the ilids. And I had recommended to him, or timidly suggested one day to him that since these are so reactive, I wonder if weaker bases might be sufficient, like sodamide or alkoxides. And he took one big look at me and says, Herr Haag, we are here at the university, and we are using phenylithium. And I made the mistake of saying, this might be of some value for some potential industrial applications. And he drew the line there. He says, we do what we do well, and we don't care about industrial applications. Well, when he came to BASF, they suggested to file patents on this, and they suggested to him to include my name and my colleagues' work and the basic inventors. And of course, Wittig wouldn't want to have any of that. He says, they are just graduate students. I found this out later from people that had attended that meeting that were former Wittig students. And but then he did come back and says, did you ever do this work with alkoxides? Which I had, of course, done secretly, but never dared to tell him about it. Interesting also that when you had a new compound, you crystallized it and purified it, and then the final proof of whether it was the expected compound or not was chemical analysis. So you send it off for analysis, carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, oxygen, whatever it was. But the routine was, and it showed his personal involvement, you had to go to his office to deposit with his secretary that sample, and with expected formula and exact calculated analysis, carbon and hydrogen content. Then Wittig would send it off for analysis, and then you waited anxiously 3 weeks until it came back. Because if it was within the expected error limits, he would pay for it. If it was off, instead of 0.3% off, it was 0.4% off the expected, then it was unacceptable and I had to pay for it. So the problem was, however, the real problem was not that I had to pay for that you could tolerate, but he would get a very bad impression of you, and he would look down on you because you are such a sloppy worker. And that was inexcusable. So sometimes when I really didn't know what it was, I sent it in by myself and paid for it right from the beginning. And when it was within what I expected, then I submitted it to Wittig for an official analysis. So there was a tremendous pressure he exerted in a very gentle, indirect way on his students to do excellent work.
Well, it seemed to me that Professor Pines had some of the characteristic of going around to see the students frequently.
Yes, oh yes, he was very much involved too. But he was, there was that tremendous difference. I worked for Wittig for almost 2 years. And he did not know I was married and I had 2 children. That's private life that just interferes with the job. Whereas Herman Pines, of course, was a real mensch, and of course he got involved and he asked you if you need any help and so on, and cared very, very much on a personal level for his students. Yes. So that was that great distinction. But otherwise, sure, the dedication to do their job well and so on, of course, that they both shared, and that's why maybe I found it very easy to accept Herman Pines' regiment.
Now, did Pines always speak English to the students? He always had a number of European students.
Oh, yes. You could call it English, yes. No, he always spoke. I don't know. I guess he had a French student, but he was here before I was, and he possibly might have spoken French to him. I don't know that. There were 1 or 2 French students before that. But basically he spoke, of course, English to all the rest of us, sure.
How would you describe Burwell as the department chairman?
Of course, I was very new at that time to the American system, to university, so I didn't have really anything to compare it to as well as department chairman. Of course, I had him also as a professor and he gave advanced courses in catalysis, special topics usually, and so on. And they were always interesting because he had a very slightly, I don't want to say aloof, but with a certain distant aspect. He didn't take things as if they were the latest gospel and so on. He knew better than that. So he just opened up often just the various ideas that people had about things and the mechanisms and interactions. And it was a rather interesting, different philosophy behind it. It was very critical and at a very, very penetrating level. But it wasn't the highly structured teaching that some other professors do. This is it and so on, and give you a guideline of a rigid system of knowledge that you are supposed to learn. He just much more stimulating and letting people think for themselves rather than giving them a set of knowledge.
You mentioned Jim White at Mobil. Most people wouldn't be aware of him.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, yeah, he was not as, and is not as well known in the general public, and even within Mobil he played perhaps a more subdued role. He was a very fine human being, rather gentlemanly, and he did some very fine work for himself too. I was involved with him very briefly only, directly. He headed efforts also in the lubrication area, in structure of oil, mineral oil and rheology, and rather than in catalysis. And he just passed away about a month ago. And that's when I heard for the first time that he had been part of the Manhattan Project. Nobody knew about it. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of fine person he was. Actually, after his retirement from Mobil, he continued to work as a consultant for $1 a year. He had his old office, and he did what he wanted to do. And he came almost every day, except for some prolonged vacations stints he did. And he just applied himself and developed the refinery models and programs for one particular refinery in Germany that they cherished very much, and he found out they needed that, and how to do inventory of different streams, how to do blending, how to assess different feedstocks, and he came up with software programs to handle all this. So this is all he did in his retirement on his own. And he occasionally got a trip out of it to Germany and so on to talk to the people there. But he worked in a very, very unselfish way all the time for no reward except his own satisfaction. Yeah.
Now, why did you decide to go to industry rather than teaching academic?
Oh, yeah. Well, at the time when I finished with Herman Pines, got my degree, of course I saw it coming, and I felt after I've invested all this time now, I wanted to get the slightly higher financial reports that industry had to offer. After all, I had a family of 3 children, and I was a little older than the average graduate student because of the time I lost during the war. So it was time to really get some financial rewards out of this. And industry at the time, already, by today's standard, it wasn't much. It was considerably more than academia could pay. And so my intention had actually been just to go to industry for 3-4 years and make a little money, and then make a final decision. And it turned out that I found the work so interesting, and I had considerable research freedom, considerably. even from day one at Mobil. I proposed research projects on my own, and they allowed me to do it. That I didn't feel any urgent need to go into academia, because it was fundamental research and exploratory research which I wanted to do. And perhaps at least my wife tells me, I'm always I might have made a good teacher. My children complain about that teacher, and they ask me questions, brief questions. They get a 10-minute lecture, and so they stop asking questions pretty soon. So maybe that part I perhaps missed. But other than that, I had what I would have wanted to. Had financial resources to buy equipment. I could devote full time to research rather than in academia, where you are sidetracked. And I occasionally did have to make a big decision when Hermann Pines was nearing retirement age, where he asked me if I would not want to join him and in the Ipatieff laboratory at Northwestern University to be his assistant for a while, with a potential opportunity of eventually taking over the laboratory. And at that time I just had to decline. I felt I was in a very good environment at Mobil, research-wise, and the people were nice. And I had 4 kids to go through college. So I perhaps that made that helped making that decision, but it was not the only one. I felt no urgency to go. I had considerable personal freedom. I could go to meetings and publish, but I was possibly in industry. And so I couldn't see myself starting again as an instructor at a university at my advanced age, I guess. I wasn't 25 anymore at that time. And I haven't regretted it. And right now, since quite a few years at Mobil, I have the opportunity to interact with all the groups as a general laboratory advisor. I'm sort of have the task to supervise and advise and all the projects in the company, and the people come to me and ask for advice, and I can interact with as many as my time allows to provide guidance. And I've taken a series of lecture notes and fundamentals in catalysis, and trying to pass on some of the experience we had to work so hard to learn. And one topic is pitfalls in heterogeneous catalysis, and one can. That's a very fruitful area. You can just read any journal of catalysis article, or many of them, and can easily spot some of the errors in judgment and conclusions that are drawn erroneously based on wrong interpretation of data and so on. And I'm trying to get this together, perhaps as a piece of learning advice for other people in general, perhaps. I have lots of in the company examples to pick from, and occasionally my own as well, of course.
You were talking about effectiveness earlier. Mm-hmm. If a company is going to apply effectiveness, is it necessary to do it from the top down, or can it be applied from the bottom up?
Oh, you need both. Some big areas you have to be aware of, they come from the top down. You just have to be aware of what the big picture is, and it comes from the top. If capital is short, no matter what you do, and there is no money available to build a new process or new reactors or new kind of things, you have to know that, otherwise you get frustrated. And so the broad guidelines must come from the top. So you're setting the boundaries and the frame. On the other hand, how do they know that there's an opportunity to come up with a new, that something can be done? They barely perceive perhaps the need, but we in the research has to perceive the need before the operating divisions know it. They don't know that there's a possibility for us to make the isopropyl ether, for instance. How would a refiner manager know? And the whole management structure know. Perhaps they know it only if others are doing it. That there is some possibility to do something new. So if the others are doing it, then they might come and say, can we do the same and have a better process, of course. And that's still a good piece of research. But something really innovative that doesn't come from top. It comes really from the individual researchers. It's usually created in one mind and perceived in the mind of one individual that has an idea along those lines. For instance, some years ago I decided there is perhaps room to take a real fundamental look in olefin chemistry. I realized that we have olefins in a refinery, and perhaps we have to have greater flexibility in going more towards individual compounds in a refinery, like ethers, individual components in a gasoline refinery. Didn't know exactly where it would lead. So I looked at improved processes, what we could perhaps do in olefin interconversions. And out of this came building out some earlier leads I had. They have the possibility to interconvert olefins. We can take propylene and make butenes from it. If we need to, we can take the butene out and recycle the remaining olefins. We re-equilibrate olefins. Well, this was something I thought we should know more about. And nobody was telling me that, of course, and that's understandable. So I developed some know-how in that area, and if you're lucky and you guess right, and then the need eventually developed. The other process I did along the same lines, it's a very minimum effort, is conversion of normal butene to isobutene. I felt that might be interesting to be able to do well. And there were a few patents out that knew how to do it, but they were not very highly selective. I mentioned this just as an example, how ideas of this kind, nobody comes from the top and says, can we do that? You have to think about before management thinks about it, because it takes a long time to develop things and come up with ideas. So you develop capabilities and put them on the shelf until the time is right, and often the time, all of a sudden, they will grab it and come to me and say, hey, I heard you have done something, I think we need it now. And that's, in order to prepare for that case, you have to do it from the ground up. And it requires, of course, a knowledge of the refinery situation, an insight in the capabilities, in potential needs. So one has to have, get that as an input, and management can provide that. And in Mobil we have done a lot of this by exposing people to really the whole business, even in fundamental research, even the fundamental research people, exposing them to, by periodic transfers to the applied research lab, and they come back and so develop contacts with them. And that's very important for stimulating the right kind of basic ideas and structures. So that's the management role, to provide that kind of environment and that kind of possibility to focus on needs and recognize it better. And the specific things come mostly from the ground.